We get to spend some time focused on the Word of God. It's very exciting. Let's see some smiles on your faces. Happiness, eagerness, I hope so. A lot of what happens during this time, whether much happens in you or not, depends not on me and how well I preach, but on you and how much you're paying attention to God and His Spirit at work in you. All right, we're in a series on the book of Matthew. We're in the middle of a very famous section called the Sermon on the Mount, and we always begin each message with an illustration because we need to apply these things to our regular life, and that's what illustrations help us do. So here's the illustration. This is actually a fictional story of a family, a household with 3 boys and a drum kit. Once upon a time, in a household far, far away, there were 3 boys and a digital drum kit. The digital drum kit was exciting at first, but then it wasn't played very often. This is what it looked like, with no one sitting at it. It was a little bit dusty, a little bit rusty. I don't know, it was made of plastic, so not rusty. And there it was, the digital drum kit. Then the 3 boys, their parents took them to a concert with a super sick drummer. And here's what that was like. Oh yes, give me some sound. I don't have any sound. This was what the concert was like with the super sick drummer, Josh Dunn. Anybody know Josh Dunn? There he is. It was amazing. And after the concert, here's what the digital drum kit looked like. Oh! Back to my shot. Back to my picture. There it is. These 3 boys played the digital drum kit all the time and fought over who would get to play it next. They were so excited, playing it as much as they possibly could until their parents lost their minds. A little bit of a sad ending to the story. But the happy ending to the story is that these three boys, fictional boys, became much, much better at playing the drums. Now, do you see the point of the illustration? What changed in the household? The digital drum kit was there before, and it was actually easier to play before than after the concert because there were less people playing it. You didn't have to fight with your brothers to get to the drum kit, to use it. But hardly anyone was using it. Why? What's the difference? The difference is something on the inside. What changed is that these 3 fictional boys saw a vision of a super amazing drummer and who they could become. They could become like that, and that vision gripped their hearts. It is a change at the level of the heart. And this is a huge part of what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. Behavior change comes from what's on the inside. What we human beings need is not a bunch of rules or just to try harder, right? Back when it was just the empty drum kit. The solution isn't to just try harder, to practice every single day and force myself. The solution is a change at the level of the heart. When I see what I could become, when I see how my life could be, and my heart is gripped by that, then real change begins to happen. Do you see it? This is an old saying, where there's a will, there's a way. Now, there are certain ways in which this is not true, but the way in which it is true is that if there's a change at the level of the heart or the will, your desire, your decisions, then all the things that need to happen in order for that thing to come to be, they'll be found. You will find a way if you have the will, the desire, the heart. We are in this series on the book of Matthew, and let me remind you where we're at in this series. This whole thing is about the life of Jesus, this whole book, and we're going through it over the fall, and then we'll actually be looking at it for Christmas as well, because we'll go through the Christmas stories in Matthew. That's the Magi, some other pieces. The genealogy, is anybody excited for the genealogy? I'm going to do the genealogy at Christmas. That's all whose son was who. It's going to be amazing. So we're going through the book of Matthew, and where we're at, so the big picture of this book, This particular version of the life of Jesus from his disciples' eyewitness testimony. Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples. He was there with him. The big picture, one of the big things that Matthew is trying to get across to us is that Jesus is a new and greater Moses. He is like Moses was for the Israelites, bringing truth from God, but he's even greater than Moses. In fact, he is greater than the temple, which we've said a number of times means the temple was where God lived on earth. And so what this means is that Jesus is God on earth. That's actually who he is. These are two big elements from the Gospel of Matthew. The man of spirit and fire is coming. We saw that in our introduction. He is the one who will change everything. He is the one who has not just human power, but the power of God himself. And he's able to change everything at the deepest levels of a human being. This is our whiteboard picture of what the whole book of Matthew looks like. You don't need to know all the details. We are in this section right here, right? There are 5 central sections of teaching in Matthew, and this is our second week. We're going to do 2 weeks in each of these, and this is our second week in the first section of teaching, which is the Sermon on the Mount, the most famous sermon in the history of the world, the most influential sermon in the history of the world. We said last week about the Sermon on the Mount, it is Jesus explaining the way to live in a new kingdom. And we spent some time last week. If you missed that, I would encourage you to go back. We spent some time trying to understand what in the world does he mean by a kingdom. And the best way, I think, for us to understand it is it's like a household, right? There are certain rules, how things work inside your household. And a different household might have very different rules. Doing the same thing in 2 different households could result in a very different outcome, right? We talked about that with screaming kids versus well-behaved kids last week, right? And so what Jesus is saying is God is now here. And you can live in his kingdom, in his household. Access to God is available in the world right now because of Jesus. And so if you choose to live in this kingdom, what is this kingdom like? How do you live in it? And the big point from last week was that God's kingdom is upside down compared to all the ways of living in this world that we are used to. It's upside down. But the truth is that it's not God who's upside down or his way. It's actually us who are upside down. Everything's different. So we looked at that last week. Everything's different because in this new kingdom, God is with you. So you don't have to worry about controlling your whole life, making sure you're safe. All those things that you would think are basics of life in this world, you don't really have to worry about because God takes care of those. And you can now live in a totally different way. A way that's focused on God, a way that is loving toward other people, even if they're not loving toward you. God's kingdom is upside down. This week, we're going to look at the other big point from the whole sermon. So we're not going through the sermon verse by verse, mostly because that would take, a year, something like that. It's very deep. It's got lots of content. If you want more on this sermon, we actually did a series on much of this sermon in 2022. That series was called 12 Rules for Life. Some of you will remember that series. And I'm going to send out some messages from that series in the weekly email this week if you are interested in going deeper into some of the topics that Jesus talks about in the sermon. But what we're doing last week and this week is we're going through kind of some high points. We're landing in a few places throughout the whole sermon and picking out these 2 big ideas, or really 3. I'll show you the one more in just a minute. The first one was upside down. The second one is inside out. God's kingdom is inside out. It's not what's on the outside that matters. It's not actually your behavior that is the important thing. It's what's in your heart that's the important thing. And that's where we got to start. That's where change has to begin. Jesus says this over and over in so many different ways, not only in this sermon, but in his entire ministry. And then the final point that he makes in this sermon, which is sort of the last chapter of the sermon. If you know, where's this sermon found? Matthew chapters 5 to 7. Yes, chapters 5 to 7. Most of chapter 7 is this. Every other kingdom will fall. Jesus is inviting us and pleading with us to live in God's kingdom with him. Because ultimately, every other kingdom, every other way of living is going to collapse. And if all you know, if the way that you have trained yourself to live is under those systems, then you are going to suffer great loss. Jesus says you might be destroyed when those kingdoms fall. So the last section of this sermon is a warning, and today we'll be just we looked at part of that warning last week. We'll look at the warning this week that's related to building your house on the rock or the sand. Okay, so let's go through it. Inside out, what do we have in this message? It's landed a number of places in the sermon. There's sort of two inside-out points that he makes in the sermon. We had the introduction to the sermon as the Beatitudes. We'll go through a couple of those in a minute. And in the first half of the sermon, the Beatitudes, and then all the way through chapter 5, really the point where it changes is right at chapter 6. But through chapter 5, his big point is this: inside out. Life in the kingdom of God, in this new household, life with God, the important thing that you need to know is that the inside determines the outcome. Just like we saw in the illustration at the beginning, how often these fictional 3 boys play the drums, how often they do that, wasn't determined by something on the outside, somebody forcing them to play the drums all the time. Well, you could try it that way, but as many of you who are parents know, that's very difficult. That's the hard way, isn't it? And it's never where you really want to end up, forcing your kid to do this over and over and over again. Sometimes you have to do that at the beginning, just like God did in the history of the world. In the beginning, in the early days, he gave us law to follow. But in the later days, he gave us his Spirit. This is a development. But Jesus' point is this: the inside determines the outcome. What was in those 3 fictional boys' hearts after they had seen this amazing drummer? They had a change of heart. They desired something. They desired it deeply, and so that automatically changed the outcome, how often they were drumming. Jesus' big point in this sermon is that's true in every area of life. It's really what's inside a human being. It's the unseen things. That's what determines how your life will go. You say, no, that's not what determines. Luck is what determines how my life will go. Or, whether other people are treating me well or being nice to me, or whether they're being mean to me, that's what determines. Or the skills that I have, sort of what my credentials are, that's what determines. Or how much money I have, or what my circumstances are in life, that's got to be what determines how my life really is. Jesus says, no. It's not any of those things that determine the outcome of your life. What determines how your life turns out is what's on the inside. And so that's what you got to change. Let me show you this from a few places in the sermon. First, right in the Beatitudes, he has this idea in 3 different ways. Blessed are those, remember this section, he's saying all the different people who are blessed, people who are really in a good position in life and with God. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. What is he saying here? He's saying that in order to really change, all of us want to change. All of us want to become, at least anybody who's a competent human being, wants to become a better person. We all want to do better at life in whatever way we're thinking of that at the moment, right? What he's saying is that those who actually affect change are those who really, really want it. You have to have a deep desire for that change, a desire to be right on the inside. And the reason it works is not because you can achieve it on your own. It's not that you will be filled, you will fill yourself with righteousness. It's that you will be filled. When you have that deep desire, you will go after God, and God will respond to you in grace. He will give you the thing that you desire, if what you desire is righteousness, being really right on the inside, getting yourself in the right place. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. This is a similar kind of idea. It's what's on the inside that determines what's actually going to happen to you. Blessed are the merciful, those who are showing mercy to other people because of something on the inside of them. Those are the ones who are going to receive mercy from God and from other people. And then this idea here, blessed are the pure in heart. What does it mean to be pure in heart? I think we take this often as just meaning we are really good, but if you think about it literally, what it means to be pure is not to be mixed with anything else. To have just one thing in your heart, and that thing being your heart set on God. There's a certain sense in which, think of our fictitious story of the three boys and the drumming. There's a certain sense in which after they went to the concert, their hearts became more pure. Not in the sense of better, but in the sense of focused on drumming. Their hearts became more focused just on one thing. It's what they thought about. It's what they thought about when they woke up, and they thought about as they went through the day. They thought about drumming. Their hearts were focused on drumming. If you have a pure heart toward God, He's really the thing your heart is gripped by, then you will see God, because He will allow you to see Him. Amazing. All right, next he moves on to a couple of illustrations in the sermon, and he talks about salt, and he talks about light. These are very interesting. You're going to see the same idea, inside out. It's what's on the inside that determines the outside. He says to his followers, those who have chosen to give their lives to Him and follow Him in this life, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. What is he saying here? What he's saying is that the real important thing about salt is not what it looks like. The important thing about salt is the quality of saltiness. If you had a whole container, you have a huge thing of salt in your house. Now, I know for us, salt is not a precious material, right? But in the ancient world, it was, right? Salt was kind of expensive. And if you had a whole container full of salt that looked wonderful, but when you tasted it, it did not taste salty, what good would it be? It's actually the core quality about something. Same with human beings. This is what he's using as an analogy. What's important about you is not what you look like on the outside at all. What's important about you is what's on the inside. Are you the way God made you to be? Are you a person of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control? And to what degree are you that? That's what's important. Similar in his next analogy, he says, let your light shine. Well, just this idea shows that the idea that there is a light inside of you. He says basically this to his disciples. Here's how you change the world, okay? Here's how you do it. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. You don't change the world by going out there and trying to force other people to change or force the world to change. You change the world by letting your light shine. What is your light? It's God in you. It's what's really on the inside. So here we have the same idea. There must be something on the inside. If you are a salty person, in the good sense, the Jesus sense, if you have allowed God to change your inside, then all you have to do is let that be seen. And God will use that to change the world around you. Moving on through chapter 5, he goes into a section where over and over and over again, he says basically, you have to go deeper than just following some rules. You have to go deeper. And this is the section, of course, where he's going through some of the laws of the Old Testament, right? Really good laws, things that are in the Ten Commandments, like don't murder. And he's saying, yes, but that's not enough. You got to go far deeper than that. So, we see in chapter 5, verse 17, he starts out, don't think I've come to abolish all of the laws, like the Ten Commandments, the Old Testament. I haven't come to get rid of that. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. To make them, to show you what kind of life on the inside produces following the law without even trying to follow it, without even working hard or forcing yourself. So he says, I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is about what's changing on the inside, not about following a bunch of rules. This is something we've been over again and again. So he says, it's not just murder, but anger that's a problem. Not just murder, but anger. Anger is not always a sin, just so you know. Anger is a natural human response. But holding on to anger, cultivating it, even liking it or thinking we need our anger to control other people, that is a huge danger. Jesus says, you've heard it was said to the people long ago, don't murder. Anyone who murders is going to be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister is subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Rakah, is answerable to the court. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fires of hell. Okay, if we wanted to translate that into modern English, we might say, anyone who says to his brother or sister, F you, is going to get in trouble with the courts. Back then, you could actually be prosecuted for something like that. But anyone who says, you're an idiot, is actually in extreme danger because of what's going on inside you. You got to go deeper. You got to get rid of that stuff. Next, he says, it's not just adultery that's a problem, it's lust that's a problem. Most of us will know these verses, very famous. You've heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But he says, but I guess I don't have it there. But he says, but I say to you, anyone who has looked with lust on another person has committed adultery in their heart. So we got to go deeper. We got to root these things out at a deeper level. In this same section, it's not just lying that's a problem, it's twisted words. And as you think about this one, there are so many of our words that are twisted in one way or another to give people a certain impression or to control or kind of urge people to go the way we want them to go. Jesus says, you've heard it was said to the people long ago, don't break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. So when people swore an oath to the Lord, they were supposed to do it. Jesus says, okay, but I tell you, don't even swear an oath at all. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And what Jesus is getting at here is very simple. And in the old-time preachers used to call this simple speech. That what we say, we kind of wear our hearts on our sleeves in a sense. We don't try to manipulate people with our language. We don't say things to sound cool or to get people to do what we want. We simply ask people for things and accept their answers. And we answer people truthfully, honestly, plainly. This is how we relate to each other and to God. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this is twisted words. These are the kinds of deeper changes that need to happen in us. This one is actually so deep. To change this, I don't know. I don't know that anyone will ever really untwist their words entirely in this life. It's virtually impossible. If you start to really analyze yourself and the things that you say and why you say things the way you say it, you will find out very quickly, especially if you ask God for help, you will find out very quickly just how twisted up each of us are in our motivations and our speech. Same section, he says, this is all about, it's deeper. You got to go deeper. It's the inside that needs to change. It's not just fairness, but generosity, blessing, and love. That's what should be coming out of a human being. So you've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. This was the Old Testament law, and you might think that sounds pretty harsh, but this was actually a law about fairness. If someone came and gouged out your eye, this sort of thing happened a lot more regularly in the ancient world than it does today. If someone came and gouged out your eye, you're not allowed to go and kill them. You're not allowed to go and kill them and then kill their whole family. you are just allowed to go and gouge out their eye. Fairness. If you get in a fight with someone and they punch out your tooth, you're not allowed to break all their teeth. You just get to punch out one of their teeth. That's really what it is. And I know this maybe doesn't relate to us in the same way, because most of us didn't grow up gouging out people's eyes and breaking people's teeth. Thank God we didn't grow up that way. But all of us grew up saying, that's not fair. All of us grew up with a preoccupation with what's fair and what's just, and am I getting as much as the other person is getting? That's what this is all about. Here's what Jesus says. Not just fairness. Here's what I say. Don't even resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek to them. Don't worry about it. If someone is massively disrespecting you in front of everybody, don't even worry about it. No big deal. If anyone tries to sue you and take all your money, your shirt. Most people, we don't sue for shirts today. A shirt was worth a lot more money in the ancient world. If someone tries to sue you and take your house, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Is that in the Bible? It's a trick question. It looks like Jesus is quoting the Bible here. He is. Love your neighbor is part of the Old Testament, but hate your enemy is not part of the Old Testament. It was something people had added on. Oh, if you're supposed to love your neighbor, obviously you must be supposed to hate your enemy, right? People who are trying to kill you, your enemies. You should hate them and attack them. Jesus says, no. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And here's the reason why, okay? Because you want to become like God on the inside. So you see how all of this is about the inside is the thing that really matters. That's what's got to change in a human life. It's what's on the inside. You've got to become like God to some significant degree. We're not going to get there perfectly in this life. But we got to become more and more like God on the inside. Some of these things we just went over, I know if you read through them as a bunch of rules, they seem crazy, right? If this were a new law that Jesus is giving, then they seem crazy. Don't resist someone who's beating me up. I should never fight back. That's not what Jesus is saying. Is he really saying if anyone ever asks you for money, you should always give it to them? You must, as a law? Does anybody follow that law? If you did, come see me afterwards, because I'm going to ask you for all your money. This is my new retirement plan. I'm going to teach Christians that they have to give away. And anyway, so this is not Jesus' point. Jesus' point is that you have to go beyond just fairness. That's his point. It's not just fairness. It's not the human heart shouldn't just be going after fairness, but the human heart has to become a wellspring of overflowing generosity, blessing, and love. That's got to be something that you actually want on the inside. God's got to change you to that place. Okay. Let me jump forward a bunch. I went back a whole long way here. And then finally, he says, no magic words, no secret formulas. God is a person. This is in the section that's around the Lord's Prayer, right? And so it's not, we don't really give into magic words too much in our culture. That was more something for other times and maybe other places today. But he says this very famously, when you pray, do not keep babbling on like pagans. They think they'll be heard because of their many words. But we do have sort of secret formulas in life. We think there are things we can do, that if we do these certain things, then our life is going to turn out a good way or the way we want. But Jesus says that's not actually how it is. The important thing deep down is that we relate to God like a real person, because God is a real person. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Just go and talk to God like a real person. That's one of the changes that needs to happen deep down. Okay. So after this, in the sermon, so he's gone through this whole section This is most of the sermon, the first 2/3. And then in chapter 6, he begins to tell us how to do it. There is actually a how to clean up the inside, how to focus on it first. Don't focus on changing your behavior. That's not the thing. If you want to become this amazing drummer, don't focus on just forcing yourself to drum for a certain number of minutes each day. You might want to do that, but the real important thing is the vision. It's that your heart is captured, so focus on the inside first. And he goes through this in a number of ways. He gives a number of practical pieces of advice. We touched on this one earlier in the offering time. Jesus teaches us in this sermon that to change our hearts, one of the things we can do is to do good in secret. Do good things secretly. Be careful, he says, not to practice your righteousness, not to do good stuff in front of others just to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. People actually did this. Don't have your name plastered on a building at a university because you gave a bunch of money, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, that's their whole reward when they do it that way. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, he will reward you. How's he going to reward you? By changing you on the inside. That's how. When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. They love to pray, standing in the synagogues, on the street corners. I tell you, they've received their reward in full. When you pray, go in your room, close the door, pray to your Father who's unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So here's the key to this teaching. Jesus is teaching us to go do good things in secret. And it's not just these two things. It's not just giving and prayer that should be in secret some of the time. He's not saying we always have to keep everything a total secret. But what he's saying is this. If you're the kind of person who goes when nobody else knows that you're doing this, you go in your room, you close the door, nobody knows if you're sleeping, if you're playing on your phone, or if you're praying. They probably don't think you're praying. If you're the kind of person who goes, closes the door in your room, and prays just between you and God in heaven, when no one else in the world knows it, that's an act of faith. You don't do this unless you believe God is real. And unless you are trying to reach Him, trying to seek Him, trying to relate to Him as a real person. That's the only reason you would do this. And when you do it, God will use that to change you on the inside. That's what He's saying. Second thing He says, lead your heart with your treasure. These are incredibly deep points. I encourage you to go back to some of these, even in the messages we did a couple of years ago, because this is a very deep section. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he says, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and mice do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. And then he says this incredible line, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Here he's teaching us another secret about how to actually change. How do human beings work? So many people want to change, but how can we really change at the level of our hearts? Jesus is saying that you can lead your heart certain places by choosing where you put your treasure. This is partly about money, but really it's just about where's your energy and attention and effort going? Imagine if you spend all your time trying to build a business. How will you feel about that business? You'll love it. It will be very dear to your heart. Imagine if you spend all your time trying to become a better drummer. How will you feel about music and drumming? You will be gripped by it. This is what Jesus is saying. It's maybe a little bit similar to our modern English expression, put your money where your mouth is. Maybe there's a similarity there as well. But Jesus is saying you can actually lead your heart. You can lead your heart in this way. We'll go through just 2 more points, and I'm going to skip a few things here because it's too much to put. Next, he says this, you got to work on yourself first. Don't spend your time trying to fix other people. This is essential if you want to grow in Christ. Don't spend all your time and energy trying to fix other people. Why? Because you can't. You can't. And if you're trying to fix them all the time, who are you not working on? The only person you have any actual authority over, yourself. This is his very famous, he says, don't judge, don't be a judgmental person. He says, in the same way that you judge other people, you will be judged. And then he has this very famous illustration. Why do you look for a speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, and you pay no attention to the 2x4 coming out of your own eye? It's a joke. He's making a joke. But for a point. You're walking around with a 2x4 sticking out of your eye, and you're trying to get a speck out of your brother's eye. Work on yourself first. And the last point he makes here is in this new kingdom. We're going to have to stop here. We won't be able to get to the very end of the sermon today. But in this new kingdom, in God's household, if you are living with Him and by His power, with Him at your side because of Jesus, then the big question is, if you're living this way, how are you going to get what you need? If you are in this world, if you're living without God, and you don't stop people who are trying to do bad things to you, if you give away your money to people who ask you for it, if you are kind to people, you don't put up the right boundaries in this world, how are you going to have what you need? And his final point here on how we change our hearts is that in His kingdom, we get what we need by asking for it. It's like living in a good household. If you grew up with really good parents, the way you always got what you needed is just by respectfully asking for it and waiting patiently. And this is the same way it is in God's kingdom. Ask, he says, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. This is a reality in His kingdom. We got to stop there for today. Next week, we'll jump into the end of this and just see His warning about rock and sand before we move on into the next section of the message. Let's pray, and we'll continue in worship.